The story begins with a family moving into an old, eerie farmhouse built in 1900, located in a small town called Coral. The house, with its wraparound porch and abandoned barn nearby, exudes an ominous atmosphere. From the very beginning, the family noticed strange occurrences, glowing orbs appearing in photos, unexplained footsteps, and knocking sounds echoing throughout the house. On the first night, while the family was trying to sleep, strange footsteps on the upper floor woke Lily, the young daughter. She whispered to her mother about the odd noises, but her mother reassured her that it was just the sounds of an old house. Both listened in silence, yet the noises persisted, as if someone was walking through the rooms upstairs. "Mom, are you sure no one else is here?" Lily whispered, clutching her blanket tightly. "Yes, sweetheart," her mother replied, though her voice wavered slightly. "It's just the house settling. Try to go back to sleep." But Lily wasn't convinced. "It sounds like footsteps, and they're getting closer." Her mother froze for a moment, listening intently. But then, just as quickly, she forced a smile. "It's nothing, Lily. Just close your eyes." While cleaning the house, the family discovered a small, abandoned cemetery not far from their property. One gravestone bearing the name Elizabeth caught their attention. Lily's parents took pictures of the area, and later, they noticed a faint white figure near the gravestone in one of the photos. This discovery only heightened their worry and curiosity. "Dad, what's that in the picture?" Lily asked, her finger trembling as she pointed to the ghostly figure. Her father frowned. "I don't know. Maybe a trick of the light. But it's shaped like a person," Lily insisted. "And it's standing right by that grave." Her mother interjected, trying to calm her down. "It's probably nothing, sweetie. Let's not jump to conclusions." One night, Lily's father spotted a tall, dark figure gliding past the living room window. He swore it stopped to peer into the house before vanishing into the darkness. Lily's mother tried to reassure him, suggesting it was just a shadow from the trees, but the fear in his eyes left the family uneasy. "I saw it, Karen," he said, his voice low and urgent. "It wasn't a shadow. It was watching us." Karen sighed but didn't argue. "Then what do you want to do about it? Call the police? Tell them a shadow is stalking us?" He shook his head. "No. But we need to be careful. There's something off about this place." As Christmas approached, the strange occurrences in the house became more frequent. On Christmas Eve, loud, powerful footsteps echoed on the porch, shaking the entire house. However, when Lily's father stepped outside with a flashlight, the thick snow remained undisturbed, showing no footprints. The family often saw dark shadows outside the windows or heard knocking at the doors, but every investigation turned up empty. Lily and her younger brother began hearing whispers in the dark corners of the house, voices they couldn't understand. "Did you hear that?" Lily's brother, Ben, whispered one evening as they sat in the living room. "What?" Lily asked, her eyes wide. That voice. It said something, but I couldn't make it out." Lily shivered. "Maybe it's just the wind." Ben shook his head. "No, it wasn't. It sounded like a woman." One night, as the family gathered around the Christmas tree, the lights flickered and went out. In the darkness, Lily heard a soft yet chilling voice say, "Elizabeth needs you." The fireplace suddenly roared to life, illuminating the faint silhouette of a woman in a white dress standing by the window. Lily's father rushed toward her with a flashlight, but the figure vanished before his eyes. They heard retreating footsteps leading them to the open door and into the snow-covered yard. Outside, they found footprints leading straight to the cemetery. "Don't follow them," Karen said, grabbing her husband's arm. This isn't normal. He hesitated, the flashlight beam trembling in his hand. I have to see where they lead. Lily spoke up, her voice trembling. Dad, please don't go. Reluctantly, he nodded, and they all retreated into the house, locking the doors tightly behind them. The family stood frozen before the snow-covered gravestones as an icy wind swept through. In that moment, they noticed a new gravestone that hadn't been there before, bearing the name Lily and the current year. This can't be, Karen whispered, her face pale. Lily clung to her father. What does it mean? No one had an answer. They returned to the house, desperate for clarity but finding none. The story ends with Lily standing in front of a mirror. Seeing the faint reflection of a woman standing behind her, smiling gently. The lingering question remains, who is Elizabeth, and why did she choose this family? It was December 2016, and the first snow had settled in the small Michigan town where I worked as a claims processor at a modest insurance company. Our team was close-knit, about 20 people. All cordial, if not friendly. That changed when Lucas arrived. Lucas joined our office in October. He was quiet and unobtrusive, almost fading into the background. Tall and pale with an unsettlingly neutral expression, he dressed in the same gray cardigan every day. I dismissed him as an introvert at first, until I started noticing his gaze. Whenever I moved around the office, grabbing coffee, fetching papers from the printer, I'd catch Lucas staring. Not the fleeting glance of someone zoning out, but an intense, focused stare. As though he were studying something only he could see. If I locked eyes with him, he'd quickly look away, pretending to be busy. One morning, I found a note on my desk that read, "I see you." My stomach tightened as I read the spidery handwriting. I showed it to Carla, my desk neighbor. "Carla, look at this," I said, my voice low. She frowned, her eyebrows knitting together. "Who gave this to you? Is it a joke?" "I don't know," I whispered. "But it's not funny. Do you think?" I glanced toward Lucas's desk. Carla followed my gaze. "Lucas? Come on, he's harmless. Just awkward." She handed the note back. "But still, this is weird. If it happens again, you need to tell HR." I nodded, but unease settled over me. Something told me this wasn't just a one-time prank. The notes didn't stop. A week later, I found another one tucked into my claim folder. "I like your perfume." My breath caught as I read it. How could someone get so close without me noticing? One day, as I walked past Lucas's desk to refill my water bottle, I heard him mutter something under his breath. "What did you say?" I stopped and turned to him. His eyes darted up, surprised, like a child caught doing something wrong. "Nothing," he said flatly, returning to his screen. But I wasn't convinced. "Lucas. If there's something you need to say, say it. Otherwise, stop whispering whenever I walk by." He looked up again, his lips curling into a faint smile. "I just think it's interesting. How people move when they're unaware they're being watched." Chills ran down my spine. "That's an odd thing to say," I replied, stepping back. "Is it?" he asked, tilting his head. His gaze unwavering. By early December, the notes had become more personal. "Your laugh is my favorite sound. I know where you go after work." My paranoia grew. And I started avoiding Lucas at all costs. But no matter where I went, I always felt his eyes on me. The night before the office Christmas party, I stayed late to finish some reports. Around 7 p.m. The building was nearly empty. As I walked toward the kitchenette, I saw Lucas sitting at a small table in the dark, his face illuminated by the faint glow of the vending machine. "Lucas?" I hesitated in the doorway. "What are you doing here?" "Waiting," he said simply, not looking at me. For what? I pressed, my nerves on edge. He finally turned his head, his eyes catching mine. The right moment. Something about the way he said it made my stomach drop. I backed out of the room, muttering, "Good night," and hurried back to my desk to grab my things. As I left the building, I swear I could feel eyes on me the entire way to my car. The next day, the office was buzzing with holiday cheer. I tried to stay close to Carla and the others. But Lucas lingered at the edges of the room, always watching. At one point, he approached me again. "Can I talk to you for a moment?" he asked. "No," I said firmly, not meeting his eyes. "It's about the notes," he added, his voice low enough that only I could hear. I froze. "What about them?" He leaned closer, and I caught the faint smell of coffee on his breath. "They're not from me." "Then who?" Before I could finish, Carla walked over, laughing. "What's going on here?" she asked, her eyes darting between us. "Nothing," I said quickly, stepping away from Lucas. But as I looked back, his expression had shifted, almost smug, like he knew something I didn't. The rest of the day passed uneventfully until I went to retrieve my coat from a side room. The moment I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me. "Lucas?" I spun around, my voice trembling. He stepped out of the shadows, holding a folded piece of paper. "You don't understand what's happening," he said, his tone eerily calm. "What are you talking about?" I demanded, backing away. He handed me the paper. It read, "They're coming." "Who wrote this?" I shouted. Lucas smiled faintly. "You'll see soon enough." Before I could react, the lights flickered. And when they came back on, Lucas was gone. The note was still in my hand. That night, as I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was following me. The note and Lucas's cryptic words haunted me for weeks. And I never saw Lucas again. It was Christmas Eve, and the icy wind clawed at my face as I parked my van in front of an old, Gothic-style building downtown. The streets were deserted. And the building stood like a sentinel in the night, its cracked facade illuminated by the faint glow of a single streetlight. The package in my hands was neatly wrapped, tied with a silver ribbon, and labeled Apartment 7F. "This place looks like something out of a horror movie," I muttered, shaking off the unease as I approached the door. The brass doorknocker, shaped like a gargoyle with hollow eyes, seemed to grin at me as I lifted it. Knock knock. The sound echoed unnaturally, reverberating as though the building itself were alive. The door creaked open before I could pull back my hand. Inside, the air was heavy and smelled faintly of damp wood and lavender. A grand staircase spiraled upwards into darkness. "Hello? Delivery?" I called. My voice seemed to sink into the walls, absorbed by the silence. A frail voice answered, soft and trembling, from the shadows of the stairs. "You're late." I squinted and saw a woman descending slowly. She was draped in a shawl that looked like it hadn't been washed in decades. Her face was pale, her eyes sunken, but her smile was unnervingly wide. "Sorry, ma'am. Traffic," I replied with an awkward laugh. "Apartment 7F, right?" Her smile faltered for a moment, and she cocked her head to one side. "Yes, you always go there first." "But it never ends there, does it?" "Excuse me?" I asked, frowning. Her words sent a chill down my spine. She pointed up the staircase. "They're waiting for you." Before I could ask what she meant, she turned and disappeared into the shadows. Her footsteps didn't echo, as if she floated away. Reluctantly, I climbed the staircase. The building groaned around me, each step amplifying the unease building in my chest. The 7th floor was pristine, in stark contrast to the dilapidated exterior. Golden sconces lined the walls, and the carpet was a deep crimson. The door to apartment 7F was slightly ajar, just enough for warm light to spill out. I hesitated before knocking. Knock knock. Delivery, I called out. The door creaked open further, revealing a man seated in a grand chair by a fireplace. His back was to me, his silhouette unnaturally still. "Come in," he said, his voice deep and commanding. I stepped inside cautiously. "Here's your package, sir," I said, placing it on a small table near the door. The man didn't turn around. "Do you know what's inside?" I froze, confused. "No, sir. I'm just the delivery guy." "Ah." He chuckled softly. "That's what they all say." "Look, I'm just doing my job," I said, taking a step back. "If you don't need anything else." "You can't leave yet," he interrupted. Finally standing. His movements were unnervingly smooth, like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. "Sir, I really have to go," I insisted, my voice shaking. He turned to face me. And my breath caught. His face was hollow and stretched, his eyes dark pits that seemed to pull me in. "Why are you afraid?" he asked, his lips curling into a grin. "Because this isn't normal," I shouted, backing toward the door. He laughed, a hollow, echoing sound. "Normal? Do you think you're still in a normal place?" I bolted from the apartment, slamming the door behind me. The hallway seemed darker now, the sconces flickering. I ran toward the stairs, but the staircase was gone, replaced by an identical hallway lined with doors. I tried the first door I saw. Locked. The next one? Locked. "Hello? Is anyone here?" I yelled, my voice trembling. A child's laughter echoed behind me, soft and distant. I spun around but saw nothing. The laughter came again. Closer this time. "Who's there?" I shouted. A door creaked open down the hall, and a young girl stepped out, clutching a worn teddy bear. Her face was pale, her eyes too large for her head. "You shouldn't have come here," she said softly. I didn't have a choice. "I'm just doing my job," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She tilted her head, mimicking the old woman's gesture. "That's what they all say." The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly as I ran, the decorations on the walls decaying with every step I took. The carpet turned to ash beneath my feet. And the air grew heavier, almost choking me. I stopped to catch my breath, leaning against a door. From behind it, I heard faint whispers. "Leave it here," the voices said in unison. "Leave it and go." I realized I was still holding the package. My hands trembled as I set it down on the floor. "Can I go now?" I whispered, my voice cracking. The whispers grew louder, overlapping until they were deafening. "It's not yours to take." Suddenly, I was back in the lobby. The chandelier above me flickered, and the front door stood wide open. I bolted outside, gasping for air. As I reached my van, I looked back. The building was dark, its windows like empty eyes. My phone buzzed. It was my dispatcher. "Hey, you all right?" she asked. I made the delivery," I stammered. "Delivery?" she said, confused. "We canceled that stop hours ago. That building's been abandoned for decades." I stared at the package still sitting on the passenger seat of my van. Before I could respond, a voice whispered from the back seat. "You forgot something." It was Christmas Eve, and the snow was falling thick and fast, blanketing the streets in a cold, suffocating silence. I was exhausted, my delivery van rattling under the strain of one last stop. The address on the package read, "The Blue House at 45 Willow Lane." The neighborhood was remote, and the houses were scattered along a cul-de-sac. their festive lights glowing faintly in the distance. But when I reached the end of the road, the house I was looking for stood out like a sore thumb. The paint was peeling. The windows were boarded up, and the porch light flickered weakly. Unlike its neighbors, there were no signs of Christmas cheer, no decorations, no wreaths, no warmth. Just the oppressive silence of a house long forgotten. I grabbed the package, muttering under my breath, and stepped out of the van. As I approached the porch, the snow crunched beneath my boots. I knocked on the door, calling out, "Hello? Delivery." There was no response. I glanced back toward the woods behind the house and froze. Small footprints, unmistakably those of a child, led from the door and disappeared into the trees. The sight sent a chill down my spine, but I shook it off. Maybe they belonged to the neighbor's kid. I knocked again, louder this time. The door creaked open a fraction, revealing a pale face peeking out from the shadows. It was a little girl, no older than 6, her hair hanging in tangled waves over her shoulders. Her eyes were wide and unblinking, and her skin was almost translucent in the dim light. "Hi there," I said cautiously. "Is your mom or dad home? I need someone to sign for this." The girl stared at me for a moment before whispering, "Mommy's inside. She doesn't like visitors." Her voice was soft, almost melodic, but there was something off about it. "Okay," I said, forcing a smile. "Can you let her know I'm here?" "You should leave," she said, her expression blank. "It's not safe." Before I could respond, she stepped back into the darkness. And the door shut softly. I stood there, unsure of what to do. Something about the house, about her, felt wrong. The silence was heavy, oppressive. Just as I turned to leave the package on the porch, a deep, guttural voice rumbled from inside the house. "She warned you." I froze, my heart pounding. The voice wasn't the girl's, it was too deep, too menacing. I backed away. But the door suddenly creaked open wider, revealing a dimly lit hallway. Against my better judgment, I stepped inside. The air was cold, colder than it should have been. And the house smelled damp and musty. The furniture was covered in dusty sheets, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling. Faint whispers echoed from somewhere deeper in the house. Their words just out of reach. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Is anyone here?" From upstairs, I heard the sound of light footsteps, quick, almost playful. "Hello?" I repeated, moving cautiously toward the staircase. The whispers grew louder, overlapping until they sounded like a chorus of voices. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched into darkness. A door at the end was slightly ajar, and faint light spilled out. The girl stood in front of it, her back to me. "Hey, kid," I said, my voice shaky. "What's going on here? Are you okay?" She didn't move. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered. "Now they'll see you too." "Who?" I asked, stepping closer. "Who will see me?" She slowly raised a hand and pointed to the door in front of her. "Look," she said. I hesitated but pushed the door open. Inside, the room was empty except for a tall, ornate mirror on the far wall. My reflection stared back at me, but something was wrong. It wasn't moving the way I was. It grinned, a wide, unnatural grin, and lifted its hand to wave. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. Behind me, the girl's voice grew louder, more urgent. "Run," she shouted. "Don't let them touch you." The whispers turned into guttural growls. And shadows began pouring out of the mirror, crawling toward me like living smoke. I bolted, the shadows chasing me down the hallway. The girl's voice followed, layered with others now. Distorted and otherworldly. I stumbled down the stairs, nearly tripping in my panic. The front door slammed shut, and I tugged at it desperately, the growls growing louder behind me. With one final yank, the door flew open, and I tumbled outside into the snow. I didn't stop running until I was back in my van. My hands trembled as I started the engine, the headlights illuminating the house. On the porch, the girl stood, her face pale and emotionless. Behind her, dozens of shadowy figures loomed, their glowing eyes fixed on me. I didn't look back as I drove away. But even as I sped down the empty road, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. A faint humming reached my ears, soft and melodic. Glancing in the rearview mirror, my blood ran cold. She was there, sitting in the back seat, her wide eyes staring at me. "You didn't listen," she whispered. The van's lights flickered, and the humming grew louder. As I turned back to the road, the last thing I saw was the girl's reflection in the mirror, her grin matching mine. Then, the world went dark. I've done a lot of odd jobs since leaving the Marine Corps, but working as a mall Santa wasn't something I ever pictured myself doing. The job came up one December, promising decent pay and hours that fit around my part-time work at a shipping warehouse. The mall wasn't exactly high-end, but it had steady traffic. And the managers seemed desperate for someone reliable for the holiday rush. They'd seen on my application that I was a former Marine medic. So I guess they figured I could handle unruly kids better than some retiree. The toughest part of the job was usually dealing with crying toddlers or the unrelenting heat of the suit. That changed on December 22nd. It was around 7:45 p.m. when I saw her for the first time, a little girl, maybe 9 years old, standing at the edge of the velvet ropes. She wasn't accompanied by an adult, which was unusual. Most parents hovered nearby, phones in hand, capturing the moment. This girl was different. Her dark hair was matted, her pale face expressionless. She wore a tattered coat too thin for the cold, and her wide eyes fixed on me as though she were studying something distant. My elf assistant, Carly, nudged me. "Hey, Santa, you've got a solo visitor." I waved the girl forward, keeping my voice cheerful. "Ho ho ho. Come on up, little one. What's your name?" She didn't answer. Instead, she shuffled forward, her steps slow and deliberate, her eyes never leaving mine. Carly frowned, scanning the crowd. "Where are her parents?" she muttered. The girl climbed onto my lap with a peculiar stillness. "What can Santa bring you this Christmas?" I asked, the words ringing hollow in the growing silence. Her lips parted, but her voice was barely above a whisper. "Do you believe in ghosts?" I blinked, unsure how to respond. Carly stepped closer. "Sweetie, are you okay? Where's your mom or dad?" The girl ignored her. Her gaze bore into mine as she repeated, slower this time. "Do you believe in ghosts, Santa?" "Well, I stammered, trying to stay in character. "Santa believes in all sorts of magical things. Now, why don't you tell me what you'd like for Christmas?" The corners of her mouth twitched upward in a grim semblance of a smile. "I want you to see them." Before I could respond, she slid off my lap and vanished into the crowd. Carly called after her, but the girl was gone. I couldn't shake the encounter. Her words echoed in my mind as I finished my shift. By the time I returned my Santa suit to the employee locker room, the mall was quiet. Most shoppers long gone. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting eerie shadows in the corridors. As I secured my locker, I heard faint footsteps. Assuming it was Carly or one of the security guards, I called out, "Hey, someone still here?" No response. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate. I followed the sound down a dimly lit hallway, the air growing colder with every step. "Hello?" My voice echoed unervingly. Then I heard it, laughter. Soft, childlike, but distorted. As though coming from a malfunctioning speaker. I turned a corner and froze. The girl stood at the end of the hall, her head tilted, her dark eyes glinting in the dim light. How did you get back here? I demanded, my voice sterner than I intended. This area's off limits. She didn't answer. Instead, she raised her arm, pointing to something behind me. My pulse quickened as I turned, but there was nothing there. When I looked back, she was gone. Uneasy, I returned to the locker room. My belongings were exactly as I'd left them, but a faint, metallic smell lingered in the air. On the bench lay a single candy cane, broken in two. All right, enough games, I muttered, grabbing my phone to call security. But before I could dial, the laughter returned, louder this time, echoing from just outside the door. Clutching the phone, I stepped cautiously into the hallway. Who's there? My voice betrayed the tension creeping into my chest. The lights flickered. For a moment, the hallway was plunged into darkness. When they came back on, the girl stood mere feet away. Her lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear. Then she raised a hand, pointing to my leg. I glanced down and felt a sharp, burning pain. Blood seeped through my jeans, pooling at my feet. I stumbled back, barely able to remain upright. Why? I gasped. She stepped closer, her voice a whisper that chilled my very bones. They're waiting for you. As I collapsed. The last thing I saw was her face inches from mine, her hollow eyes filled with something far older than a child's gaze should ever hold. When I awoke, the paramedics were loading me onto a stretcher. Security insisted they'd found no one, and the cameras showed nothing but an empty hallway. Yet in my pocket was the broken candy cane, sticky with fresh blood. I left the job the next day and never looked back. Every Christmas since, I've avoided malls, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear that laughter, soft, distorted, and far too close. I was 12 when I first heard Uncle Dominic's Christmas Eve tale. It wasn't just the story that held me, it was the way he told it. His voice would drop low, his pauses carefully placed, as if daring the shadows to creep closer. Shall I tell you the story of the winter caller? He asked that night, the flickering fire casting eerie shapes on the walls. The younger cousins giggled nervously, but I sat straighter, drawn in. Yes, I said firmly. Dominic's eyes met mine, a faint, almost imperceptible smirk curling his lips. Be careful what you wish for. Dominic's story began in a small northern English town where winter nights seemed endless. One December, he was 13. Staying late at school to help the village choir prepare for their Christmas service. That year, a new girl named Elise had joined. She was quiet, with pale skin and hair that shimmered like frost in the moonlight. But her singing was otherworldly. It felt like her voice was pulling at something inside you, Dominic said. Staring into the fire. Like she was calling to something. What do you mean, calling? I interrupted, unable to hold back. Dominic glanced at me, his expression unreadable. That's the thing. Isn't it? You don't know until it answers. After choir practice that fateful night, Dominic offered to walk Elise home. The streets were dusted with snow, their breath clouding the air as they walked. You're really good, Dominic said, breaking the silence. Elise smiled faintly. I've had practice. Where are you from, anyway? No one's ever said. Her smile faltered. Does it matter? Dominic hesitated. Not really, I guess. It's just, your voice. It's not like anyone else's. Elise stopped walking. Do you believe in things you can't explain? Dominic frowned. Like ghosts and stuff? Not ghosts, she said softly, staring into the distance. Things older than that. Things that don't belong here but can still reach us. What are you talking about? She looked at him, her eyes suddenly sharper, more focused. You should be careful what you listen to. The silence around them grew heavier as they approached the edge of the woods. The moonlight barely reached through the thick canopy, casting strange shadows on the snow. Are you sure this is the way? Dominic asked, his voice unsteady. Elise nodded. I like the quiet. Dominic glanced around nervously. It's too quiet. Elise stopped again, tilting her head as if listening. What? He asked, his voice louder than he intended. She raised a finger to her lips. Do you hear that? Dominic strained his ears. At first, there was nothing. Just the faint rustle of wine through the branches. Then he heard it, a low hum, like a single note held too long. What is that? He whispered. Elise didn't answer. Instead, she stepped off the path, her movements slow and deliberate. Elise, stop, Dominic said, grabbing her arm. She turned to him, her face strangely calm. It's okay. It's just a song. No, it's not. We need to go back. Her gaze shifted past him, her lips parting slightly. They're here. Dominic followed her gaze, and his stomach dropped. A figure stood between the trees. Its shape twisted and unnatural, like it was struggling to fit into the space it occupied. Its head was crowned with something jagged, antlers, horns, or perhaps both, and its eyes glowed faintly, like embers buried in ash. Elise, run! Dominic shouted, but she didn't move. The figure stepped closer, its movements unnervingly smooth despite its monstrous form. Elise! Dominic yelled again, shaking her. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Don't you see? It's beautiful. Are you crazy? He snapped. We have to go. The hum grew louder, filling the air with a pressure that made his chest ache. Dominic grabbed Elise's hand, yanking her back toward the path. Let me go, she cried, her voice breaking. No way. We're leaving. The figure stopped, tilting its head as if curious. Then came the sound, a deep, guttural growl, followed by the jangle of bells. Dominic froze, his grip tightening on Elise. What is that? Elise's expression shifted, her calm facade cracking. It's coming. They broke into a run, Dominic dragging Elise along as the sound grew louder, closer. The snow beneath their feet seemed to shift unnaturally, the path twisting and unfamiliar. Faster! Dominic shouted, but Elise stumbled, pulling him down with her. When he turned to help her up, she was staring back at the figure, her face pale. I can't, she whispered. You have to. Tears streamed down her face as she shook her head. It wants me. No, it doesn't. Dominic yelled, pulling her to her feet. We'll make it. The figure let out a low, resonant noise that rattled Dominic's teeth. He didn't look back, didn't dare. Dragging Elise toward the faint glow of the village lights. When they finally burst into the safety of the main road, Dominic collapsed, gasping for air. Elise stood silently beside him, staring at the woods. Are you okay? He asked between breaths. She didn't answer. Elise? She turned to him, her face unreadable. It's not over. What do you mean? But she only shook her head and walked away, leaving Dominic alone in the snow. The next morning, Elise was gone. The villagers searched the woods but found no trace of her. Only Dominic remembered the hum, the figure, and the feeling that something ancient had watched them. Years later, Dominic told me this story, his voice heavy with regret. You can't outrun it. he said. Once it's seen you, it doesn't forget. What happened to Elise? I asked. Dominic's eyes darkened. I think she called it. And I think it answered. The fire crackled between us, casting flickering shadows that danced like figures in the corner of my eye. For the rest of the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was listening. And when Dominic disappeared a year later on Christmas Eve, I knew I'd never stop hearing that hum. The Whispering Pines. When I was a child, I loved hearing stories about my father. According to my mother, he was a man of many talents, a brave explorer, a genius scientist, and even a savior of countless lives in distant lands. But he was also a ghost in our lives, always elsewhere, always busy. I clung to those tales, imagining a day when he'd come home, and we'd finally be a family. It wasn't until I turned 10 that I began to question these stories. My classmates didn't have fathers who were perpetually absent. Why hadn't he sent letters or pictures? Why did Mom's eyes water whenever she mentioned him? Some things take time, Sophia, she'd say with a sad smile. When he comes back, it will all be worth it. But I stopped asking. Her pain was too much to bear. The search begins. One winter evening, I found an old photograph of him tucked inside a box in the attic. He stood tall in front of a dense forest, his piercing eyes staring directly at the camera. On the back, a single phrase was scrawled, Whispering Pines. It was the first clue I had ever had about his whereabouts. Mom, what's Whispering Pines? I asked, but she froze, her face turning pale. Forget about it, she whispered, snatching the photo away. It's not a place for you. That night, curiosity gnawed at me like a hungry animal. Whispering Pines had to be real. I started researching it online and discovered an old, abandoned town in the north, swallowed by dense woods and wrapped in chilling legends of people vanishing without a trace. The message. Weeks later, I received an email from an anonymous sender. It contained no text, just a single attachment, another photo of my father, this time standing by a frozen lake. I recognized the backdrop immediately. It was Whispering Pines. Who are you? I replied, heart racing. How did you get this? A response came almost immediately. Come to Whispering Pines. He's waiting for you. I didn't tell my mom. She'd never let me go. Instead, I packed a bag and lied about staying at a friend's house. Whispering Pines was only a few hours away. I took a bus to the nearest town and walked the remaining miles through the snow-covered woods, the frosty air biting at my cheeks. The encounter. By the time I reached the edge of the town, the sun had set, leaving the landscape bathed in eerie moonlight. The place was exactly as I'd imagined. Crumbling buildings half buried in snow, twisted trees looming like skeletal hands, and an unsettling silence broken only by the distant howl of the wind. I followed the faint tracks in the snow, leading me to a cabin near the frozen lake from the photograph. Light seeped through the cracks in the boarded windows, and my heart pounded as I approached the door. Before I could knock, it creaked open. A man stood there, older than in the photos but undeniably my father. His eyes, so familiar yet so cold, locked onto mine. Sophia, he said, his voice both welcoming and distant. You've grown. I didn't know what to say. Tears welled in my eyes, and I stepped forward to hug him, but he didn't move. Instead, he gestured for me to come inside. The cabin. The interior was sparse, a table, 2 chairs, and a roaring fireplace. Strange carvings covered the walls, symbols I didn't recognize. A faint hum filled the air. Almost imperceptible but constant. Why did you leave us? I finally asked, my voice trembling. He sighed, sitting across from me. I never wanted to leave, but I had no choice. Some things are bigger than family, Sophia. Bigger than you or me. What things? Before he could answer, the hum grew louder, and the fire flickered unnaturally. Shadows danced across the walls, forming shapes that seemed to move independently of the flames. You shouldn't have come here, he said abruptly, standing. His face twisted with something between fear and regret. It's not safe for you. What do you mean? What's happening? I demanded, but he didn't answer. Instead, he walked to a trapdoor in the corner of the room and opened it, revealing a dark staircase descending into the earth. Follow me, he said. The descent. Against every instinct screaming at me to run, I followed him. The air grew colder with each step, and the hum turned into whispers. At first, they were incoherent, but soon I began to hear fragments. She's here. She must not stay. The staircase ended in a cavern illuminated by faint, bluish light emanating from a pool in the center. My father turned to me, his face pale and his eyes filled with sorrow. This is why I left, he said, gesturing to the pool. They've been waiting for you. Who? I asked, stepping back. What is this? They chose you, Sophia. Just like they chose me. But I couldn't let it happen to you. That's why I stayed away. To protect you. The whispers grew louder, the pool began to ripple, and dark shapes emerged from its depths. They were humanoid but wrong, their features blurred, their limbs too long, and their voices like shards of ice in my ears. You brought her, one of them hissed, its hollow eyes fixed on my father. The bargain is complete. Run, my father shouted, shoving me toward the stairs. The escape. I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted up the stairs, the whispers now a deafening roar. Behind me, I heard my father scream, followed by an unnatural silence. The moment I reached the surface, the cabin collapsed in on itself, leaving nothing but a smoking crater. I ran through the woods, tears streaming down my face, until I reached the road. A passing truck driver found me and took me back to town. The aftermath. When I told my mom what had happened, she didn't seem surprised. Instead, she hugged me tightly and whispered, I hoped you'd never have to know. Know what? I asked, but she wouldn't answer. To this day, I don't know who or what my father had made a bargain with, or why I was part of it. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the hum, faint, but unmistakable. And I wonder if one day, the whispers will come for me, too. It all began in the kitchen, late one December night. My brother Ethan was kneeling by the oven, adjusting the temperature for the pies he'd spent the evening baking. His concentration was almost comical. Ethan wasn't exactly the culinary arts type. Careful with that pie crust, I teased. Don't burn it like last time. Ha. Ha. Ethan shot me a sarcastic look before pulling out the tray. The aroma of cinnamon filled the air, but something was off. The scent seemed too sharp, almost metallic, like rust. I frowned. Is that normal? What? Ethan asked, distracted. The smell. It's... Before I could finish, the kitchen lights flickered, and a loud bang echoed through the house. Both of us froze. Did you hear that? I whispered. Ethan nodded, his expression uneasy. Sounded like it came from the basement. Neither of us moved for a moment. The silence was thick, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator. Then, as if on cue, the basement door creaked open. Ethan glanced at me. Probably just the wind. Wind? I repeated, incredulous. Inside the house? Ignoring me, he grabbed a flashlight and headed for the door. Wait. What are you doing? I hissed. Relax. I'll be back in a second. Reluctantly, I followed him down the creaking stairs. The basement was colder than usual, and the flashlight's beam barely cut through the shadows. See? Ethan gestured toward the far corner, where an old chair lay tipped over. Just this thing falling over. No big deal. I wasn't convinced. Something about the darkness felt wrong, like it was watching us. Let's just go back upstairs, I urged. But Ethan didn't move. His flashlight had landed on something else, a large, wooden trunk that neither of us had seen before. Was this here before? He asked, walking toward it. No, I said quickly. Ethan, let's go. Relax, he said again, crouching to examine the trunk. It was covered in strange symbols, carved deeply into the wood. The carvings didn't look like anything I'd ever seen, spirals, jagged lines, and what might have been letters, though not in any language I recognized. This is weird, Ethan muttered, running his fingers over the lid. As soon as he touched it, a low groan filled the room, like the sound of something ancient awakening. Ethan, stop! I shouted, grabbing his arm. But it was too late. The lid creaked open on its own, revealing a dark void inside, no contents, no bottom, just an abyss that seemed to stretch endlessly. Ethan stepped back, dropping the flashlight. What the hell is that? He whispered. Before I could answer, a voice echoed from the trunk, a deep, guttural sound that wasn't human. Leave. I stumbled backward, pulling Ethan with me. Did you hear that? I asked, my voice shaking. Yeah, he said, eyes wide. But I didn't just hear it. I felt it. The air in the basement grew colder. Frost creeping up the walls. Then, slowly, something began to emerge from the trunk. A hand, pale, skeletal, with nails like jagged knives, gripped the edge. Run! I screamed, dragging Ethan toward the stairs. We bolted up and slammed the basement door behind us. Ethan leaned against it, panting. What was that thing? He asked, but I didn't have an answer. Suddenly, the lights flickered again, and the sound of footsteps echoed through the house, not from the basement, but from upstairs. Is someone else here? Ethan whispered. I shook my head. The footsteps grew louder, descending the staircase toward us. Then a voice called out, eerily calm. Ethan? Lucy? It sounded like Mom. But it couldn't be her, Mom was out of town for the week. That's not her, I whispered. Who else would it be? Ethan said, but his voice betrayed his fear. The figure appeared at the bottom of the stairs, shrouded in shadow. It looked like Mom. But her movements were too stiff, her smile too wide. Why don't you come sit down, she said, her voice layered with an unnatural echo. We have so much to talk about. Ethan took a step back. Mom? The figure tilted its head, the smile never faltering. Ethan, it said softly, you shouldn't have opened the trunk. What are you talking about? He stammered. Before she could answer, the house plunged into darkness. The only light came from the basement door, which was now glowing faintly. Ethan, we need to go, I whispered, grabbing his arm. But he didn't move. His eyes were fixed on the figure, now stepping closer. Ethan! I shouted. He turned to me, his face pale. I can't move. The last thing I saw before the lights went out completely was the figure reaching for him, its smile stretching impossibly wide. When the lights came back on, Ethan was gone. I ran outside, desperate for help, but the world wasn't the same. The snow fell in perfect, frozen flakes that didn't melt. The houses around me were pristine and lifeless, like a dollhouse village. And in the distance, I heard the same voice calling my name, echoing through the cold. Now I'm writing this from a phone I found in the snow. If you're reading this, please believe me, something is wrong with this place. If you see a girl wearing a purple scarf and an AC/DC hoodie, that's me. Please, don't let it take me too. It was December 2019, a cold winter evening, when something happened that I can't seem to shake. I've thought about sharing this countless times, but I was never sure if it would resonate as the bizarre, chilling tale it truly is. Maybe you'll decide. My then fiancé, now husband, and I had planned a cozy dinner at a small, quaint Christmas market in a remote Swiss village. He was running late, picking up our dog, Max, from his dog sitter. I arrived first, enjoying the twinkling lights and the scent of mulled wine and roasted chestnuts that filled the frosty air. Max wasn't just any dog. He was a rescue from a remote part of Croatia, where he'd survived harsh winters as a stray. Though he'd settled into his new life, his instincts were sharp, his eyes always scanning. That night, I felt thankful for his alertness, though I didn't know yet why. As I wandered through the market, I found a quieter spot near the edge. The cheerful chaos of the crowd felt overwhelming alone. A shadow emerged from the sea of people, a tall man, his face gaunt and pale, his eyes almost too still. "Evening," he greeted in accented English. His voice was low, unsettling, as if it didn't quite belong to him. "Good evening," I replied hesitantly. He looked me over, then glanced at Max, who had started wagging his tail but stayed rooted by my side. "Beautiful dog. A rare breed?" "He's a mix," I answered, trying to sound casual. "Just a rescue." The man's expression shifted into something darker. "Not just a rescue," he muttered, almost to himself. "He's special." I forced a nervous laugh. "Well, he's special to me." Before I could say more, the man crouched down, reaching for Max. His movements were too quick, too familiar. As if he already knew Max. "What's his name?" he asked, stroking Max's head without waiting for permission. "Max," I said, taking a step back, feeling uneasy. "No," the man whispered, his hand lingering too long on Max's collar. "That's not his name." A chill ran through me. "Excuse me?" The man's eyes locked with mine. They seemed darker now, almost black. "You don't understand. He doesn't belong to you." "I think you've made a mistake," I said firmly, pulling Max closer to me. "He's my dog." The man's lips curled into a sneer. "You think you know him? You think you've seen all he's capable of?" My breath hitched. "What are you talking about? Who are you?" Instead of answering, the man's grip tightened on Max's leash, and he pulled. Max barked. Loud and sharp, his hackles rising. I held onto the leash with all my strength, my heart racing. "Let go of my dog!" I shouted, my voice trembling but firm. "You don't deserve him," the man hissed, his voice growing more guttural, almost inhuman. "He's not yours to keep. Leave us alone." I yelled, feeling panic rising in my chest. Max growled, a deep, guttural sound I'd never heard before. It startled the man enough for me to yank the leash free. He stumbled back, his expression twisting into something between anger and fear. "You don't know what you have," he said, his voice shaking now. Then, with a last, lingering glare, he added, "But you will." Without another word, he melted into the crowd, disappearing as suddenly as he'd appeared. My hands were trembling as I knelt to comfort Max. His barking had drawn attention, but no one approached. They all just stared, whispering among themselves. Minutes later, my fiancé arrived, oblivious to what had just happened. As I told him, his face darkened with concern, but he tried to reassure me. "It's over now," he said. "Let's just enjoy the evening." But it wasn't over. As we walked back to our car, I felt eyes on us. The streets were eerily empty for a festive night. Every sound, footsteps, rustling leaves, distant laughter, seemed amplified. Halfway to the car, Max froze. He let out a low growl, staring into a narrow alley. My fiancée followed his gaze, squinting into the shadows. "There's no one there," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Are you sure?" I asked, clutching Max's leash tighter. "It's just shadows," he replied, though his eyes lingered on the alley a moment too long. I tugged Max's leash gently. "Let's go." As we turned, a faint whisper reached my ears. It wasn't the wind. It was a voice. "He's not yours." We didn't look back. The next morning, I found something on our doorstep, a small, weathered tag. It was old, the lettering almost illegible, but one word stood out, Argos. Max sniffed it and whimpered. To this day, I don't know who that man was, what he wanted, or why he thought Max belonged to him. But sometimes, late at night, I catch Max staring at the front door, his ears perked, as if waiting for someone. And sometimes, I think I hear whispers. The dollmaker's curse. The old mansion at the edge of the woods had been vacant for nearly a decade before the Thompsons moved in. It was a bargain they couldn't resist, spacious, a large backyard, and a price tag well below market value. Why so cheap? Sarah Thompson had asked the realtor. The woman shifted uncomfortably before replying. There, she hesitated. Were some incidents involving the previous owner? Incidents? Jack, Sarah's husband, pressed. The realtor sighed. The dollmaker, as she was known. She lost her daughter in a tragic accident. After that, she became obsessed. Made lifelike dolls, some said too lifelike. Eventually, she disappeared without a trace. Sarah and Jack exchanged uneasy glances but dismissed it. Rumors had a way of inflating over time, they reasoned. They signed the paperwork and moved in with their 7-year-old daughter, Lily. At first, the house felt like a dream. Lily loved her new room, complete with a bay window overlooking the woods. Sarah enjoyed the kitchen's vintage charm, and Jack appreciated the spacious garage. For a few months, life was idyllic. Then came the dolls. One evening, Sarah found a small porcelain doll sitting on the windowsill of Lily's room. It was dressed in an old-fashioned lace dress, its blue eyes unnervingly vibrant. "Where did this come from?" she asked Lily. Lily shrugged. "I thought you gave it to me." Sarah frowned. "No. Maybe Daddy found it somewhere." Jack denied knowing anything about the doll. Assuming it had been left behind by the previous owner, Sarah moved it to a box in the attic. But the next morning, it was back on the windowsill. "Did you take it out of the attic, Lily?" Sarah asked, a slight edge to her voice. "No, Mommy." "I swear," Lily replied, her eyes wide. Over the following weeks, more dolls appeared. Each was unique, with unsettlingly realistic features. A red-haired doll in a green velvet dress sat on the couch. A boy doll in overalls appeared at the dining table. Despite their efforts to remove them, the dolls always returned. Sometimes in different rooms. Late one night, Sarah heard whispers. Faint, like the rustling of leaves, but unmistakably voices. She nudged Jack awake. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Jack strained his ears. The voices seemed to be coming from the attic. Grabbing a flashlight, he headed upstairs while Sarah waited nervously at the bottom of the steps. The attic was cold. The air thick with the scent of dust and decay. Jack swept the flashlight beam across the room. At first, nothing seemed out of place. Then he saw them, dozens of dolls, arranged in a semicircle as if waiting for an audience. In the center was a larger doll, nearly life-sized, with jet-black hair and a vacant expression. "What the hell?" Jack muttered. One of the smaller dolls turned its head. Jack stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight. "Sarah," he called, his voice shaking. "You need to come up here." "Why? What's wrong?" Sarah called from the stairs, hesitant to take a step further. "Just, come see this." Reluctantly, Sarah climbed the stairs and peeked into the attic. Her breath caught in her throat. "Oh my God!" she whispered. "What are they?" "Dolls," Jack replied, his voice flat. "But they moved." Sarah glanced at him. "What do you mean they moved?" Before Jack could answer, the larger doll's head tilted slightly, its glassy eyes locking onto Sarah. She gasped and grabbed Jack's arm. "We're leaving. Now." The next morning, Sarah and Jack sat at the kitchen table, discussing what to do. "We should just go," Sarah said, her hands trembling as she held her coffee cup. "I don't care about the money. This place isn't safe." Jack hesitated. "We can't just abandon the house. What would we tell people? That it's haunted by creepy dolls?" "I don't know, Jack. I just know I don't want Lily here anymore." As if on cue, Lily entered the kitchen, holding the life-sized doll from the attic. "Where did you get that?" Jack demanded, standing up so quickly that his chair toppled over. Lily tilted her head. "She came to me. She said she wants to stay." "Put it down, Lily," Sarah said, her voice tight. "Now." Lily hugged the doll tighter. "She'll be mad if I do." "Who will be mad?" Jack asked, his voice rising. Lily's gaze grew distant. "The doll maker." That night, the family barricaded themselves in the master bedroom. They could hear footsteps outside the door. The soft pitter-patter of tiny feet. Jack gripped a baseball bat, his knuckles white. Sarah held Lily tightly, whispering reassurances she didn't believe. "Mommy," Lily whispered, her voice trembling. "They're mad." "At what, sweetheart?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "At us. For taking their place." Jack looked at Sarah, his face pale. We should make a run for it. Get to the car." Sarah nodded reluctantly. On the count of 3, she whispered. Jack slowly unlocked the door. 1, 2. Before he could reach 3, the door burst open. Dolls flooded the room, their tiny hands reaching out. "Go!" Jack yelled, swinging the bat wildly. Sarah grabbed Lily and ran, dodging the swarm of dolls that seemed to pour from every corner of the house. Lily screamed as one latched onto her leg, and Sarah kicked it off with a cry of desperation. "Keep going!" Jack shouted, his voice fading as more dolls overwhelmed him. Sarah reached the front door, Lily clutched tightly in her arms. She glanced back to see Jack fall, the dolls swarming over him like ants. "Jack!" she screamed, but his face was already disappearing beneath the porcelain horde. With a sob, she flung the door open and ran into the night. As she reached the car, she set Lily in the back seat and climbed into the driver's seat, fumbling with the keys. "Mommy?" Lily said softly. "Not now, baby," Sarah whispered, starting the car. "Mommy, she's here." Sarah turned to see Lily holding the life-sized doll in her lap, its glassy eyes staring back at her. A slow, sinister smile spread across its porcelain face. The car's engine roared as Sarah screamed.